The next day dawned, and there were days when people flocked to the aquatic city of Venzir, better known as the capital of the Great Rock Empire. Not far away was a large university that looked like an enormous palace. People came to this city because it had the most prestigious university in the world. The day for the entrance ceremony at Colosseo Academy arrived, and from the first day of admission, the academy was bustling with promotions to recruit new members for clubs. The students in charge of recruiting began attracting everyone's attention by saying that all they had to do was put their fingerprint and stamp the club membership form. Two students started talking to each other. One of them was quite excited since this year the competition to recruit new students was fiercer than last year. The other student mentioned that there were many students this year, both from the hot classes and cold ones. There were two classes in the academy: cold class whose specialty was swords, bows, spears among other weapons, and hot class whose specialty was magic. The students of the academy had to develop general knowledge about everything, in addition to their specialization. All this over the course of 4 years. One of the students started flipping through the pages of the form and explained to his friend that among first-year students, these were the ones attracting the most attention. Tutor from the Don Quixote family. He was famous for his skills with a spear, and Bianca from the Usher family, she was famous for archery. She was the main candidate for recruitment since she had tied for first place in the practical test. Following them were the Baskerville triplets, known as the Iron Blood Swordsmen. They took 3rd, 4th, and 5th place, but this was not surprising since they were from Baskerville after all. No explanations needed. However, there was one person who received more attention in the hot class group, a new monster called Sinclair. It was said that she had obtained an incredible score, 1st place in the practice test and 2nd place in the written test. And there was another person. The name that occupied the 1st place in the comprehensive written evaluation was clearly our boy Victor van Baskerville. Victor wore academy clothes and some nice glasses. With a smile, he subscribed to the channel since it supported me a lot. While the students were talking among themselves, Victor lowered his head and started walking. There was no need for recruiters to look for someone who only took 1st place in written skills, not in practical skills. If a person like Victor joined the club, it was going to end up ruining the atmosphere. Among the new students, there were more than 10 called Victor, so for them, it was annoying to find him. To avoid being noticed at the academy, Victor had given up the Baskerville surname and applied as a commoner, but he never thought he would stand out like this. While Victor was walking around the area, and the club recruiters were handing out registration forms, the triplets started following him from behind with the intention of protecting him. He had heard that it was more difficult for commoners to enter the academy. It was more discreet to focus on discreet writing than on practical skills. He should avoid attracting people's attention as much as possible in order to move comfortably. At that moment, someone caught the senior's attention, asking her to take a look over here. The students began to get excited upon seeing a blonde-haired girl. She had many fans, and many had entered the academy just to see the senior. She had a pious and holy appearance. She was beautiful. With a nervous look, she started greeting everyone and asked them to calm down. She was the school president and vice president of the newspaper club named Dolores Rune Quavadis. Upon seeing that everyone was interested in joining the newspaper club, she became somewhat confused. But the reality was that people were interested in her. Victor, who was behind her, decided that it would be best to avoid her as much as possible since she was the school president. But at that moment, Dolores turned around and her gaze fixed on our Victor. A few hours later it began to get dark, and everyone started heading towards the dormitories. After searching for a while, Victor finally found the door, but at that moment someone approached him and was surprised to see that he had also been assigned to this room, which meant he was his roommate. Upon hearing this, Victor turned to the side and saw a brown-haired boy named Piggy, who was very excited. Victor, who was somewhat confused, also introduced himself. Piggy came a little closer and with a pleasant smile decided to get along with him. Victor remembered this guy named Piggy well, before regressing when he came to help the triplets. Piggy, who carried a bag of bread, decided to share the food with him. He was a good guy who had extended his hand first and had taken care of many things for him. At that moment, Piggy was bullied by his vicious roommate. That was the beginning of his misfortune, and this guy ended up dead. He hoped something similar wouldn't happen this time. Victor entered the room and threw his backpack on the floor. The beds were in 2 levels, so Piggy asked him to choose whichever one he liked best. With a smile, Piggy turned around and asked if he was going to go to the welcome party for new students later tonight. Victor did not respond, and upon seeing this, Piggy realized that it had been a stupid question. It wasn't mandatory to go, but he was sure there wouldn't be any new student who wouldn't participate. If Victor didn't make friends with his classmates or the seniors here, he would have a hard time during the 4 years. Victor refused, saying that he wasn't going to participate, and upon hearing this he was somewhat confused. He couldn't believe that Victor really wasn't going to attend the welcome party for new students. Seeing his confused face, Victor confirmed again that he wasn't going. Piggy panicked and explained that if he didn't go to the party, the seniors would get upset with him. Even among his classmates, he would be out of the scene. Piggy started bombarding Victor's head with a ton of information, saying the name of each student who was going to attend the party. Victor remembered that even before his regression, Piggy was excellent at gathering and analyzing information. After saying this, Piggy got excited and asked if he had changed his mind. But to his surprise, Victor refused again to go to the party, leaving poor Piggy in shock. Victor turned his back on him, left the room and explained that he simply did not want to attend the party, asking Piggy to have fun. Piggy was somewhat surprised but still decided to accept this and did not continue insisting. Victor left his room, and Piggy also wished to learn how to have the coldness that our boy had. Several hours later, night fell and the sky filled with black clouds, covering the beautiful moon. Victor put on his mask and night hound clothes and stood atop a house roof, contemplating the beautiful moon. In the middle of the night, not far away in some abandoned warehouses, a group of men gathered and lit a fire inside a barrel. They felt relieved now that they no longer heard the whining of small children. The man with a mohawk, with a smile, mentioned that the warehouse had been full of children these past few days. The brown-haired man asked where all the children had gone, and the bald man revealed to them that a cart had arrived at the warehouse and taken everything away. From what he had heard, it seemed like they were going to a daycare run by Quavatis. The man with the mohawk explained to Arthur that if he asked about useless things he would end up in trouble. While they were distracted talking among themselves, a man carrying a sword on his back began to approach them. With a threatening voice, he asked the men to stop talking and stay on guard if they wanted to take home some coins for their miserable lives. The man started staring at them and began licking his lips. He was the meat grinder known as Ron Bartison. He passed by them and called them trash without pride ever since he had reached the graduate level. They, low-level mercenaries who didn't even have mana, were protesting, leaving the three somewhat terrified and making them shit themselves in fear. With a look full of excitement, he began to wonder if there was no strong guy outside. He wanted to cut a piece of meat quickly. In response, someone asked him if he was Ron Bartison. He thought one of the men had asked him this. He couldn't believe that a low-level mercenary dared to say his name despite being just that, a low-level mercenary. Ron started unsheathing his sword and as he turned around, saw that the three men were lifeless on the ground. Upon seeing this, he couldn't help but enter in shock and start asking himself what this was. At that moment, someone called him by his name again and made him remember that 4 years ago, he had made a contract with a demon, killing and sacrificing the family that lived next door. Ron drew both swords, went on alert, and adopted an offensive stance. Later, Ron had joined the Northern Guild Union, constantly extracting information and passing it to the demon, and in the end, he had betrayed the allied human forces. During guard duty, he had transmitted the location of the platoon's training area to the enemy. Ron little by little began to lose his patience, asking the mysterious person to stop saying nonsense and show themselves once and for all. Just before Ron could even realize it, Victor appeared behind him and revealed that just like that, the platoon had been destroyed. Noticing Victor's presence, Ron tightly gripped his sword, turned around and in the blink of an eye swung them forcefully, launching a powerful attack at Victor. But he simply disappeared, causing his cap to fly through the sky while dodging the attack in the process. Upon seeing that the attack had failed, Ron couldn't help but panic and become somewhat confused. While poor Ron was trying to understand what had happened, Victor used the Beelzebub sword and cut off his arms without much effort. Ron fell to the ground and began crying in agony upon seeing that his arms had been cut off. He started denying knowing anything about the allied human forces, asking Victor why he was doing this to him. While Victor's eyes were shining, he turned his head towards him and thought that he was right since this hadn't happened yet. Victor grabbed Ron by the head and revealed to him that he knew Ron had made a contract with a demon. Ron started crying and couldn't help but remain in shock. He couldn't believe that someone knew about the contract he had with a demon. Just before he could say another word, his face began to deform, slowly becoming fatter. Just before Ron could reveal something, his head exploded. In a matter of seconds, Ron lost his life. Victor put his hand inside his jacket and mentioned that he had died because his head had exploded. Victor took out his diary, stained his finger with Ron's blood and crossed out his name. He was the third. After doing this, he closed his diary. It had been created through memories before the regression and Sinhuendi's research. This diary was called Blacklist, traitors who had sold humanity to demons even before the era of destruction. It contained information about demon worshippers who were to be killed. Victor put the diary in his jacket. The 3 traitors of the demon that he had killed today had their heads explode before he could kill them. While the wind was blowing, he started to look to one side, and it didn't take long for him to realize that if this was the demon's ability, it meant they were hiding inside the capital, more precisely one of the 10 elite bodies that had made a contract with them. Not far away, someone began taking off their mask using both hands. This man's face was sticky and his body was surrounded by a strange energy. That same night, the bell of the tower began to ring, and not far from the area there was a mansion. Victor entered the mansion and using the sword Beelzebub massacred all the men who were present, making the place fill with corpses and blood. He went out to the balcony and started observing the light of the moon. While his hand was releasing a demonic energy, he revealed that this was person number 29 that he had killed today. Everyone had died or their heads had exploded at the mention of the demon. He assumed these were the terms of the demon's contract. Victor took out his journal and began crossing off the names of the people he had just killed. In the end, no information could be obtained about the location of the 10 superior corpse demons. He expected a rather long and arduous fight. He did not expect there to be a harvest on the first day. For now, he decided it was better to return to the academy. He started jumping from rooftop to rooftop until some time later, he reached the academy. Without making any noise, he jumped inside and landed on top of a branch. He started staring at the window and remained silently thinking. Inside the academy, the welcome party for new students was being held. Victor decided to get down from the branch, changed his clothes, jumped and landed on the ground, then began to stand up and dust off his clothes. He put on his glasses and decided to at least show his face in case something went wrong. Inside the academy, the welcome party was taking place, where there was a buffet and everyone was eating and happily enjoying themselves. At this party, the triplets were also present. They grabbed a pitcher of beer and started drinking like never before. Not long after, the president of the school Dolores arrived and the students went crazy, saying that they loved her. At this party, students could also enjoy wine. While some were chatting with beautiful women, others volunteered to be waiters to serve wine. While the students were enjoying the party, Victor also decided to attend and entered the room. Victor began to observe the blonde-haired boy who was talking with women and the woman who was serving wine. He had never thought that those two would be in the same year. A great hero who led humanity to victory along with Camus Morgue during the era of destruction. Among them, he was always at the forefront and led the battlefield. He was a genius from Don Quixote, from the 7th generation family, and he was known as Spear of the Sun, called Tutor La Mancha Don Quixote, and the archer who brought down countless demons, a genius from Usher, from her 7th generation family. She was known as Divine Bow, called Bianca Poe Usher. At this party, there were many other faces that Victor had seen on the battlefield. He closed his eyes and couldn't help but start smiling since he never thought he would meet them like this. He also remembered that Camus Morgue had also entered the academy. Not far from Victor, a student asked another who was trembling if he wanted to listen to some music. The student who was trembling was none other than Piggy. While holding a mug of beer, he became somewhat nervous. The other student put his hand on his shoulder and explained to him that he was supposed to do it when his senior told him, asking why he didn't just do it already. Upon hearing this, the girl who was behind them started screaming and announced that the freshmen were going to sing. A lot of people gathered around Piggy and he couldn't help but get a little nervous. Victor looked at the crowd and upon seeing Piggy, he was somewhat surprised. The poor Piggy began to cry since he didn't want to sing, and upon seeing this, the girl brought a giant jug of beer and asked him to stop crying. If he drank it all in one go, he wouldn't have to sing. Seeing how enormous the jug was, Piggy couldn't help but remain terrified and perplexed, and with a tear-filled look, he asked her how someone like him could drink all that. The student started smiling and with a terrifying look gave him the order to drink without complaining. Several seconds passed, and Piggy did nothing. Seeing this, they asked him if he wasn't going to obey his seniors. Upon hearing this, Piggy had no other choice. He grabbed the beer jug and without hesitating for a second, started drinking like crazy. While he was drinking, the students began to enjoy it and couldn't help but start laughing. Piggy was not used to drinking so much beer, so not long after, he started vomiting and everyone began laughing at him and nicknamed him Vomit Pig. Piggy, who was vomiting, couldn't help but start crying, and even though he wanted to do something about it, he couldn't stand up to his seniors. At that moment, a cloak began floating, and several seconds later, Victor appeared and placed his academy cloak over Piggy's vomit, leaving everyone in shock. They couldn't help but wonder who he was. Victor began to look at them with a calm gaze and remained silent. After vomiting, Piggy started panting heavily. Before Victor regressed, Piggy had dropped out of school because he couldn't endure the bullying, and had become a low-ranked government official who had led a hard life while taking care of his parents. Victor met Piggy again on the front line after the time of fall began. He was one of the few who volunteered to go to the front, and with his amazing strategy and information analysis, he saved multiple lives, including our Victor's. Piggy was a friend who deserved respect. He was somewhat confused when he saw Victor, and just before he could ask, Victor asked him to return to the dormitory first since he was going to take care of this. He couldn't stand by doing nothing while his friend was being humiliated. The student who was bullying Piggy put his hand on Victor's shoulder and asked what he was doing, and if perhaps he had gone crazy, and how dare he interrupt when a senior was speaking. Victor remained calm and did not respond, and seeing this, the student gave him a strong slap and realized that he was Piggy's classmate. Both belonged to Ice Core Class B according to him. Considering how he'd intervened, it seemed that Victor felt confident in himself. The triplets couldn't help but get furious. They couldn't believe that Trash had dared to touch the master. Victor's cheek turned red like a tomato. Using his hand, he adjusted his glasses and started staring intently at the triplets. Even though the triplets wanted to kill this bastard, they couldn't do it since they remembered that Victor was a commoner in the academy. He was going to kill them if they revealed his identity. While the student was harassing Victor and Piggy, the girl from before asked him not to be so hard on the freshmen since, as they're seniors, they should treat them well. She clasped her hands together and began to smile because in reality she had another plan in mind. She brought out another large jug of beer, placed it on the ground, and if Victor could drink all of it, they would let both of them go. Victor remained silent while on the other side Piggy was in shock. With a worried look, he asked Victor not to worry about him since he was fine. But just before he could finish his sentence, Victor grabbed the jug, stood up, and without hesitating for a second started drinking it, leaving everyone shocked and speechless. The girl and the other student couldn't help but start laughing since it was a mixed drink with high alcohol content. It contained vodka and rum, so there was no way a human could drink more than a liter of this. But to everyone's surprise, Victor continued drinking as if nothing happened, slowly emptying the large beer mug, leaving them shocked. In the blink of an eye, Victor drank all the beer, placed the mug on the table, and began wiping his mouth. After doing this, he took Piggy, who was feeling unwell, turned his back on the seniors, and said goodbye to them. They remained silent, unable to understand what had just happened. The student who had been bullying Piggy put his hand on Victor's shoulder and asked him to wait a moment. At that moment, an intense and suffocating energy spread throughout the room, and even Tudor and Bianca were shocked upon feeling this energy. While Victor's eyes were shining, with a piercing gaze, he asked the student if he still needed something. Feeling Victor's gaze and energy, the student couldn't help but start trembling in fear, and removed his hand from Victor's shoulder. President Dollars approached upon hearing the commotion, and with a confused look, she asked why it was so chaotic here. Upon hearing her voice, the student couldn't help but become alert and think that this wasn't good. He and the others became somewhat nervous and with a forced smile explained to her that a first-year student had vomited, asking her not to worry as they would take care of it. Dollars approached them and started scolding them, saying that they couldn't treat the freshmen cruelly since they needed to maintain the academy's image. While Victor and Piggy were walking away, in a low voice, he thanked him. Seeing how cool Victor had been, the triplets couldn't help but feel excited and covered their mouths. Tudor and Bianca were somewhat confused as they didn't know if they had been mistaken in feeling the strange and suffocating energy. In the middle of them stood a woman with white hair, who couldn't help but be somewhat impressed and start to smile. She began to observe Victor and couldn't help but start blushing because she had found a good person. She was Sinclair, from the Ice Core class. She had obtained rank number 1 in the practical exam and rank 2 in the theoretical exam. The next day, once the welcome party was over, everyone attended their classes. At the academy, the Ice and Fire Corps attended classes together. The teacher began giving a lecture to everyone. They all took out their notebooks and started copying down the most important points with great attention. Through this method, a competitive structure for secure elites was created, thus increasing concentration among students, and it was the policy of the academy. The combat theory professor named Vinci Moore closed the book and with a serious look marked the end of the lecture on the culture of the barbarian tribe. Now that the lecture was over, the students couldn't help but feel somewhat relaxed. Based on the discovered locations of the barbarian tribe, the professor asked everyone if anyone could tell him their hypothesis about the location of the barbarian tribe's fortress. Upon hearing this question, many began to avert their gaze to avoid answering. From Ice Core class, Tutor opened his notebook, started scratching his head with his finger, and remembered that the location of the confrontation between Balak and the Empire had been at heights 1, 8 and 75 in front of southern region. Despite trying hard, he couldn't find an answer to Professor's question. From the Ice Core class, Bianca put her hand under her chin, closed her eyes and started to think. She remembered that the areas where they had collided were all in low-altitude locations, and considering that it was a depression, she thought their fortress must be in a low-altitude region. While everyone was trying to find the answer, Sinclair stood up, raised her hand, and with a smile decided to answer the professor's question, leaving both Bianca and Tutor in shock. Seeing that she was Sinclair, rank 1 of the Fire Corps, Professor Vencymorg, who had his arms behind his back, gave her permission to respond. With a cheerful smile, she explained that in the army, according to the public academy, the location of the close combat between the barbarian tribe and the Empire was in Highlands. She put her arms behind her back and continued with the explanation. Behind her sat Vikir. He closed his eyes and began to think. The 29 from yesterday, all of them had a strong stench of demons, and before dying, their faces had exploded. Vikir began to think deeply about why their faces had exploded. If this was the ability of an elite corpse hiding in this capital city, there was one place he could think of. He decided to ask Cindy Wendy to investigate around that area. While Vikir was deep in his thoughts, Piggy, who was sitting next to him, started tapping his shoulder with a look full of panic and began trying to get his attention. Not long after, the attention of almost all the students focused on Vikir, who were somewhat confused. The teacher couldn't help but become enraged and realized that the Ice Corps wasn't as good as the Fire Corps. He couldn't believe someone would dare sleep during the first class. Vikir started adjusting his glasses with his hand and explained to the teacher that he was not sleeping. Seeing that he had dared to respond to the teacher, Piggy couldn't help but be in shock. This made the teacher even angrier, and seeing that he had dared to respond, he asked him what his name was and told him that everyone had seen him with his eyes closed, asking if this was his excuse. Vikir remained calm and explained that his eyes were closed, but he wasn't sleeping. Upon hearing this, the teacher admitted that he had been mistaken, and Vikir told him not to worry as it was understandable. The professor began to lose his patience, and with a look full of rage, he started to wonder what kind of psychopath had entered the academy. He sighed and decided that getting angry wasn't worth it. Due to the answer Sinclair had given, the Ice Corps had earned 1 point out of 10 in behavior points. If Vikir could answer his question, he was going to give him and the Ice Corps the points, leaving poor Sinclair somewhat surprised. The professor began pointing at Vikir with his finger and with a threatening look told him that if the answer was incorrect, the entire Ice Corps would get negative points. With a calm voice, Vikir refused since this was unfair, but the professor became enraged and still decided to ask him the question. He had to state the location of the Empire's army and where the Balak tribe had fought, and with that location, he had to tell him where he believed their fortress was. Sinclair sat down, and she couldn't help but feel somewhat worried because compared to other tribes, information about the Balaks was hard to obtain, so the difficulty of the question was really high. Bianca couldn't help but feel furious because due to Vikir everyone in Ice Corps would be lost. Vikir began to look at the ground and remain silent. He started imagining his friends from the Balak tribe eating meat. Several seconds later, he raised his head and with a smile decided to reveal the location of the fight between the Balak tribe and the Empire. He began to answer the professor's question, leaving Tutor and Bianca speechless. Vikir's answer was correct as the professor was shocked and even Sinclair was left without words. Vikir had revealed all this since after the Ahuman incident. The Balaks had moved their fortress since then, so for now there was no problem. Piggy began to sweat and was perplexed. He didn't know how Vikir knew the answer to such a complicated question. The professor put his hand under his chin and with a surprised look began to wonder how he knew about the thesis that had not been verified by the academic world. At that moment, the professor remembered that his name was Vikir, and upon doing so, his eyes filled with surprise and he couldn't help but start sweating, as he recalled that someone named Vikir had obtained first place in the theoretical exam. Now that Vikir's answer was correct, he earned 10 points while the rest of the Ice Corps earned 1 point. Tutor and Bianca began to observe Vikir and remained silent. The professor, who had his arms behind his back, mentioned that although he had obtained first place in the theoretical exam, He could not overlook the fact that he had his eyes closed during the lesson, so he decided to deduct 10 points. Victor accepted this without complaint and decided to be more careful in the future. Sinclair began to look at Victor. She had not realized that he had obtained first place in the exam since Victor was a common name. While the sun's rays were entering the class through the window, Victor stood up and remained silent. Tutor, who had his head resting on his hand, began to observe Victor, and it didn't take long for him to realize that he was the one who had come first in the theoretical exam. But then he decided to stop thinking about him since because of him almost all of Ice Corps ended up with a point deficit. Just seeing nerds like him made Tutor want to hit them. He couldn't help but start smiling at the thought that Victor was the smartest when it came to theory. He began to wonder if this could be useful to him during practical lessons. Several hours later, the sun disappeared and the sky filled with clouds. Run flat was a sport with 20 people on each team. Points were obtained when the ball was in the goal area of the other team. The main equipment were some gloves and a ball. It was against the rules to use mana and weapons. Aside from this, it was a game where any method could be used to score goals. Someone wearing boots stomped hard on the ground. This person was none other than Tutor. He grabbed the ball and started running at great speed. Other players tried to take the ball away from him, but he was too fast. He grabbed the ball tightly and it started to shine. With a smile, he proclaimed himself as the best in run flat and thought this was his moment to shine. When they saw Tutor, the girls thought he was very hot and started cheering him on. While on the other side, Bianca thought this was a sport for barbarians. Tutor was so fast that no one could catch up to him. But at that moment, 3 blonde players appeared in front of him. They were the triplets. They began staring intently at Tutor, called him an arrogant bastard, and asked how he dared try to break through their defense barrier. Upon seeing the triplets, Tutor couldn't help but smile as he realized they were the troublesome triplets from the Iron Blood Swordsman family. Just before the triplets could make a move, Tutor moved at an incredible speed and dodged 2 of them, leaving them in shock. With a smile, he apologized to them since he hadn't planned on facing monsters directly. Seeing that Tutor was mocking them, they couldn't help but get angry and think this wasn't good. At that moment, the missing triplet number 3 appeared in front of him and with a determined look decided to take the ball from him. Tutor began to extend his hand backward and a powerful energy started to form in the palm of his hand. Using all his strength, he struck the triplet in the chest, causing his body to be thrown backward. Despite the fact that the triplets were strong, Tutor's blow was so powerful that he flew backward. Tutor, who had one hand extended toward him, couldn't help but start smiling even more if he had to face them. Then he didn't plan on losing. He started running towards the enemy base. He was very strong even without mana or weapons. He was the prodigy of Don Quixote run flat. Nobody on the enemy team was able to catch up with Tutor. For him there was no point in memorizing theory. If one was a true fighter, the only thing needed to win was strength. While he was running towards the enemy base, something caught his attention. In front of the base stood Victor, and it didn't take him long to realize that he was the one from this morning's conference with Professor Venci. Victor couldn't help but grit his teeth and feel somewhat annoyed since he had told the triplets not to send Tutor towards him. He simply decided to step aside. Tutor prepared to run even faster and decided to mock Victor a little. He gained momentum, preparing to hit Victor with his shoulder so that not only would he study, but also focus on training. While Tutor was slowly approaching, Victor remained calm and began to look at the ground. Once Tutor hit Victor using his shoulder, the one who went flying was himself since Victor didn't even move from the spot. The impact was so strong that Tutor lost consciousness. Upon witnessing this, Sinclair and Bianca were shocked and couldn't help but feel concerned for Tutor. Several seconds later, his body fell behind Victor. He began to observe him with a confused look and remained thinking in silence. He was planning to dodge, but didn't know why he had run towards him. He fell to the ground and started pretending to be in pain, and decided to fake being injured to raise suspicion. After a few minutes, Tutor slowly began to regain consciousness. He opened his eyes and couldn't help but be shocked. He was lying on the ground and was surrounded by players from his team who had come over to see if he was okay. He started looking around and saw that everyone was very worried about him, even the girls. He didn't know what was happening or if he had fainted. He thought that maybe he had fallen asleep during the game. Once he fully regained consciousness, he remembered that he was going to bother Theory Rank 1 Victor by bumping a little against his shoulder, but Tutor didn't remember what had happened afterward. He began to sit up and saw Victor, who was standing dusting himself off. Seeing this, it didn't take him long to realize that during that physical fight with the nerd Victor, he had fainted. After dusting off his knees, Vicar started dusting off his shoulders. Tudor couldn't believe that he had lost against someone like Vicar. He gritted his teeth in frustration and decided to try it again. The run-flat match continued its course and the players from both teams prepared to keep playing. The players gave the ball to Tudor, the triplets stood in front and got ready to take the ball away from him, while on the other side Vicar, who was standing behind them, simply stayed still. Tudor's gaze fixed on Vicar. He knew something was wrong, so he decided to do it again. Bianca and Sinclair started to watch the game, and they couldn't help but feel somewhat confused and surprised at the same time since they didn't know what was happening. Instead of heading towards the enemy base, Tudor began running towards Vicar and the triplets, leaving everyone confused. Tudor started staring at them, and with a look full of determination, he caught their attention. The triplets became furious and decided not to let him pass through them. They lunged at Tudor and tried to stop him and take the ball away from him. But Tudor started moving at high speed and without much effort evaded the triplets, leaving them in shock. Now that the path was clear, with an angry look, he began running towards Vicar. Vicar, who was standing still, had told the triplets to keep Tudor away from him. He didn't know why he kept approaching him. Tudor began to stare intently at Vicar. For him there was no way this could be a coincidence. He decided it was time to use the best skill he had. He used the Azure Spearman family's run-flat secret technique called Saint Spear Tackle. He started running even faster towards Vicar and his eyes began to shine and the giant spirit of a spearman appeared behind him. With this attack, Tudor was determined to take down Vicar. While slowly he was getting closer, Vicar simply remained calm and didn't even move. Several minutes later, a gray-haired boy with scars on his face and crossed arms named Sancho asked Tudor if he was awake. Once again, Tudor was lying on the ground because he had fainted again. Upon realizing this, he became alert as he did not know what had happened. Quickly, he sat up, put his hand on top of his head and panicked when he realized that he had fainted again. With a calm look, Sancho asked him to calm down. Then, he began to look at Tudor with a serene gaze and revealed that after hitting Vicar with a high-speed tackle, he had bounced off him at great speed and had flown into the air. He turned his back on Tudor, started putting on the equipment. He could understand why Tudor was focusing on Vicar. He knew that he was definitely hiding something. He decided to go against him this time. Upon hearing what Sancho had just said, Tudor, who was sitting behind him, was somewhat surprised. While the fierce match continued its course, Sancho began to walk towards Vicar. His friend had been deceived twice. He couldn't just stand by doing nothing. Sancho Barataria was an exchange student who had come from the Mercenary Guild Association in the north. He picked up the ball that was on the ground. Due to his overwhelming physique, he wasn't considered eligible for his age group in his league, so he had decided not to play run flat. He grabbed the ball with both hands, started staring intently at Vicar. On the frozen land of the north, the newborns of the elders who were on the brink of death fought desperately. It meant that they were all warriors. The triplets became fearful again, clenched their teeth tightly and with a determined look decided not to let him pass this time. While Sancho's eyes were shining, he began running towards the triplets and using his arm pushed all three aside without much effort. The bodies of the triplets were thrown backwards and passed by Vicar, who simply stood still in silence. Seeing that the triplets couldn't keep anyone away from Vicar, he began to stare at them with a piercing gaze and asked if they wanted to die. Feeling his gaze, the triplets started crying and begged him for forgiveness. While Vicar was distracted, Sancho began advancing quickly towards him with the intention of knocking him down. He was moving at such a high speed that he was destroying the field and creating a smoke screen. He began to stare at Vicar, clenched his teeth tightly, and decided it was time to end this. While he was slowly approaching, Vicar simply remained calm and didn't even move from the spot. Sancho extended his hand backward and prepared to strike Vicar with all his power, intending to see if he could withstand all of his strength. Using the momentum, he struck Vicar in the abdomen with all his might. Several seconds passed and nothing happened. For Sancho, it was as if he had hit a mountain. Upon seeing that Vicar hadn't even moved an inch, Sancho couldn't help but start trembling and sweating profusely in confusion. Seeing Sancho's expression, Vicar decided to play along with him. He lifted his feet off the ground and not long after, his body was forcefully thrown backward, leaving poor Sancho shocked and unable to understand what had just happened. To avoid appearing as if he were faking it, Vicar's body fell several meters back. Upon seeing that Sancho had been able to break through the enemy team's defense, the spectators were astonished. Some began to worry about Vicar since they didn't know if he was dead, but others didn't care because at this rate, Classa was going to win. Sancho's hand was trembling. He started looking at his hand with a shocked expression. He had felt as if Victor wasn't human. Sancho's hand began to tremble even more, and while he was trying to process the situation, one of the triplets stealthily appeared behind him and prepared to snatch the ball from him. Just before Sancho could realize, the triplet took the ball from him and started running towards the enemy base to score a goal. Sancho turned around, and upon seeing that he was going to score, he couldn't help but panic and think that this wasn't good. Now that the path was clear, the triplet scored a goal and the referee blew his whistle indicating that Class B had won. The triplets and the players of Team B started celebrating the victory and couldn't help but feel happy. All the players began to praise the triplets and started tossing them into the air. The result of the match was 0-1, so Class B had won. Now that the game had come to an end, Victor stood up and began dusting off his clothes. At that moment, someone appeared behind him and using a bottle began pouring water over Victor's head, leaving him somewhat confused. This was none other than Sancho. Several seconds later, once the bottle was empty, he began to smile and explain that Victor was the secret contributor to Class B's victory, so he shouldn't just stand here. Tutor, who had his arms resting on his waist, simply started smiling, thinking that Sancho was right. He approached Victor, rested his arm on his shoulder, and with a cheerful smile asked him to be happier since his victory had made him retire. He wanted to teach Victor a lesson during practical classes because he was jealous of him, but now he had realized how embarrassing that was, so he apologized. Victor, who had his head wet, started looking at him and remained silent. Sancho appeared on the other side of him, put his hand on Victor's shoulder, and with a cheerful smile asked him what exercise he was doing since he had a solid build. He thought that he had used mana. Although at first Victor remained silent, then he took off the equipment from his head and with a sincere look explained that he was a commoner so he couldn't use mana. Upon hearing this, Tutor extended his hand towards him and thought it was a shame because with such a blessed body, if he'd received proper training, he'd have been an expert like himself. While they were talking, 3 girls who were holding towels appeared and caught their attention by saying that they could use these towels to dry off the sweat. Upon hearing their voices, Tutor turned around, and when he saw that they had brought towels, he couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised. While Sancho was handing a towel to Victor, Tutor turned his back on them and started walking away with the girls, thinking that his classmates were the best. After giving the towel to Victor, Sancho went over to Tutor and both of them started talking among themselves. The Azure Spearman family's hero, Tutor, and the Mercenary Guild's ace, Sancho. They were going to become heroes who would save humanity by hunting an infinite number of demons during the time of the fall. Victor took off his glasses and couldn't help but start smiling, as it was strange to think that they had a past like this. Seeing Victor without glasses, Sancho and Tutor were left speechless, while on the other side Bianca, Sinclair, and the other girls couldn't help but start blushing. Victor took off his glasses and started wiping his head with the towel. After wiping off the sweat, he put the towel around his neck and began to look to one side. According to the girls, he was very handsome. But our Victor did not know that his days at the academy were about to become problematic from this moment on. Several hours later, once night fell and the lights went out, somewhere in the city someone cornered Lloyd Dorksler, 52 years old, who began to feel very afraid. This person was none other than the nocturnal Hound Victor. The place was filled with corpses. He drew his sword and revealed that according to the information, Lloyd was the leader of the House of Information and the director of the orphanage. He had conspired with the demon and had sold children from high-ranking families. While the Beelzebub sword was emitting an intense demonic energy, Victor began to stare intently at Lloyd and with a piercing gaze asked him if he thought it would go unnoticed. Lloyd, who was sitting with his back against the statue, began to observe the blade of Victor's sword, and upon seeing the solid aura it had, he quickly realized that he was a swordmaster. Upon hearing this, Victor started looking at his sword. His aura was in quite a solid state, but it was still closer to a liquid state. To be more specific, he was at the level closest to being a graduate. He approached Lloyd and advised him to work with him to catch the demon. If he did so, he would be compensated accordingly. Just before Lloyd could make a decision, the shadow of something large appeared in the sky, preventing the moonlight from hitting Victor's mask. At that moment, half of a tower appeared right above Victor and began to descend towards them. The tower struck forcefully against the area where Lloyd was, creating a great curtain of smoke. Just before the tower could hit the ground, Victor moved back, avoiding being crushed. Once he stopped his moving body, he looked up and saw someone standing on top of the tower that had been cut in half. This man was wearing a mask made of human skins and had a staff resting on top of a bucket made of human faces. Victor started staring at him since he had the same overwhelming energy that he felt even from afar. He didn't know if this man was an elite corpse. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.